Alright everybody, this is the Reader coming back at you with Who Was George Washington Carver? Chapter 3. When George woke up the next morning, he stepped outside. The owner of the barn, Maria Watkins, saw him. She figured he was hungry, so she fixed him some breakfast in the main house. "What's your name?" Maria asked him. "I'm Carver's, George," he said. That sounded as if Carver owned George. Miss Watkins, who was black, didn't like that. Slavery had ended more than 10 years earlier, and nobody owned anyone else. So Miss Watkins called him George Carver. George told Miss Watkins that he was in Neosho to go to school. He didn't have a place to live yet, but he'd figure something out. There were about 3,300 people living there, almost 3 times as many people as in Diamond Grove, and about 1 of every 8 residents in Neosho was black. Diamond Grove had only 16 black people living in the whole town when George grew up there. I'm sorry, I gotta fix my bed. Hold on a second. Looks weird. Okay, that looks a little decent. Okay, George stayed in Neosho for a year or so and learned just about all he could at the one-room Lincoln School. This simply sharpened my appetite for more knowledge, he wrote. He found that if he wanted more schooling, he'd have to move again and again and again. At the same time, many former slaves were moving from the South into Kansas and other northern states in search of a better life. In 1878, George hitched a ride with one such family on the way to Fort Scott, Kansas. George rode in the back of a wagon for part of the 80-mile trip and walked the rest of the way. In 1879, he moved to Olathe, Kansas. In 1880, he moved to Minneapolis, Kansas, and then to Paola, Kansas. At each stop, George's agreeable personality and willingness to work hard made it easy for him to find a family to take him in. In Fort Scott, he moved in with Felix and Mattie Payne and their family. Felix was a blacksmith in Olathe. George moved in with Cece and Lucy Seymour. George helped Miss Seymour with her laundry business. In time, he moved with their family to Minneapolis. In Paola, he moved in with Willis and Delilah Moore. These were all black families who lived in mostly white towns. In this period, sunshine and shadow were profusely intermingled. George wrote, in other words, there were both good times and bad times. The good times including finding schools in every town he lived. He never wanted to stop learning. One classmate remembered that George, who had grown to 6 feet tall and thin, would rather collect plants and leaves at recess than play games. The bad times, however, included cruel encounters with racism. The worst of it came in Fort Scott, where George witnessed a lynching, a black man being murdered by a group of white men. As young as I was, the horror haunted me, he said. George left Fort Scott shortly after. Other instances involving George, personally in one town, he and a white friend went out to breakfast. When they sat down, the waiter told them he would serve the white man, but not George. This kind of racism was legal in those days under Jim Crow laws. In 1883, George got word that his brother Jim had died from smallpox. Jim was 23 years old. He had left the Carver farm in a few years and earlier. He had left the Carver farm a few years earlier and moved to Arkansas to find work. Although George had not seen his brother much after leaving home, he wrote that he felt as never before that I was left alone. Jim Crow laws. In 1865, the 13th Amendment officially ended slavery. But blacks in the United States, especially in the South, still suffered under Jim Crow laws. The laws were named after an offensive black character from a song in the 1800s. These laws kept blacks from using the same restaurants and hotels as whites did, and they allowed for separate but equal facilities such as restrooms or drinking fountains for blacks and whites. In reality, while facilities were separate, these usually weren't equal. Places reserved for blacks were often much worse than those for whites. Some Jim Crow laws lasted until 100 years after the end of the American Civil War. In 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court ended separate schools for blacks and whites. In 1965, civil rights laws finally put an end to separate but equal. George found comfort though in his friends who cared about him. He moved back in with the Seymour family in Minneapolis. This is where George took his middle name, when he began getting mail intended for a different George Carver in town. He added the initial W to his name so the postman could tell the two men apart. A friend asked if the W stood for Washington. George thought that sounded good, so he became known from then on as George Washington Carver. George opened a laundry business, washing and drying clothes for other people, in Minneapolis, and bought a small plot of land. He then sold the land for a profit and moved to the larger town of Kansas City. He entered a school to learn shorthand and typewriting. He thought he might want to work for a telegraph office, but he decided business school wasn't enough. George wanted to go to college, so he began writing to colleges he might attend. Alright, stay tuned for chapter 4. And subscribe to my channel, like,